Rebecca Stillman had always dreamed of restoring a historic home, of taking something with a rich past and breathing new life into it without erasing its soul. When she finally bought the Victorian-style house at the edge of the historic district, she knew it was more than just a real estate investment, it was her life's project. Every architectural detail, every inch of the original molding, and every creaky floorboard held a history she intended to preserve. Unlike the sleek, modern developments slowly creeping into the neighborhood, this house had character. It had been neglected for years, standing there like an old guardian of the past, its once vibrant paint now peeling, its stained glass windows hidden beneath layers of dust. But to Rebecca, it wasn't an eyesore, it was a masterpiece waiting to be restored. She had spent years working as an architect, specializing in historical restoration, and this was her chance to prove that beauty and authenticity could survive in a world obsessed with convenience and uniformity. Not everyone shared her enthusiasm. From the very beginning, she noticed how some of her neighbors looked at her house with thinly veiled disapproval. The most vocal among them was Harris Welch, a retired police officer who had lived on the street for nearly 3 decades. In his eyes, the house was nothing but a decaying relic that needed to be bulldozed to make way for something practical. From the moment Rebecca introduced herself, he made it clear that he didn't approve of her project. His comments were subtle at first, passing remarks about how some houses aren't worth saving or how people like you come in, thinking you can change everything. But there was always something behind his words, something almost personal. She shrugged it off at first, attributing it to the grumbling of an old man set in his ways, but as the months passed, she realized Harris wasn't just another disgruntled neighbor. He was watching her, and not in a way that felt casual. He seemed to have an uncanny awareness of everything happening at her house. He would comment on shipments of wood and stained glass before she had even unpacked them. He seemed to know exactly which contractors she had hired and when they were scheduled to arrive, as if he had access to her calendar. Once he even mentioned seeing her blueprint sketches, though she had never shown them to anyone. Rebecca started to feel uneasy, but there was no direct confrontation, no outright hostility, nothing she could point to and say, "This is a problem." Instead, it was a series of unsettling moments that built up over time, a feeling that her every move was being scrutinized, dissected, and judged. Her discomfort turned into full-fledged anxiety when small but inexplicable things started happening inside the house. Tools would go missing and turn up in places she would never have left them. One evening, she returned from a supply run to find that someone had carefully removed a panel of decorative molding from the front hallway. It hadn't been broken or pried off, it had been carefully unscrewed and set aside, as if someone had been examining it. When she mentioned it to one of her contractors, he jokingly suggested that maybe the house had a ghost. But Rebecca wasn't laughing. She had changed the locks after moving in, and as far as she knew, no one else had access to the property. She started double-checking everything, making sure to lock the doors and windows, but that sense of intrusion never quite left her. There were days when she swore she smelled cigarette smoke in the house, even though she had never smoked a day in her life. At night, she sometimes woke up to the feeling that someone had been there, standing just outside her bedroom door. But no matter how many times she checked the security system, there was never any footage of an intruder. It was just her alone in a house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a target. Harris's behavior only added to her unease. He had a habit of standing outside in his yard, staring at her house for uncomfortably long stretches of time. Sometimes, when she caught his gaze, he would smile, not a warm, neighborly smile, but something colder, like a challenge. Other times, he would offer unsolicited advice, telling her that some projects were doomed from the start, or that she was wasting her time on something that won't last. Once, after she mentioned the expensive renovations she had planned for the foundation, he shook his head and muttered, "A shame to put all that money into a place that might not be standing in a year." At first, Rebecca told herself she was overreacting. Maybe Harris was just an old man set in his ways, frustrated that his quiet neighborhood was changing. Maybe he resented her because she was younger, independent, doing something he didn't understand. but deep down she knew it was more than that. There was something in his tone, something in the way he watched her that felt personal. Then, one evening as she was locking up for the night, she found something that shattered any illusion she had about Harris being just another grumpy neighbor. Tucked under her porch light was a photograph, an old, faded picture of the house from decades ago, back when it was still grand and well maintained. But it wasn't the house that caught her attention. It was the man standing in front of it, smiling proudly at the camera. It was Harris. The next morning, she knocked on his door. When he answered, he didn't even pretend to be surprised. "Ah," he said, leaning against the frame, "figured you'd find that sooner or later." Rebecca held up the photo. "You used to live in my house." Harris shrugged. "A long time ago, before things changed." Her grip tightened around the photograph. "Why didn't you tell me?" He laughed, a low, dry sound that made her skin crawl. Would it have mattered? Rebecca didn't know what to say to that. She had assumed Harris's hostility was about the neighborhood, about progress versus tradition. But this wasn't about the street or the style of her home. This was about something deeper, personal. She could see it in his eyes. "Let me give you some advice, M.S. Stillman," he said, stepping closer. "There are some places that don't belong to just anyone. Some places don't want to be changed." She took a step back. "Are you threatening me?" He smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. "I'm just saying, not everyone gets to keep what they take." Rebecca didn't reply. She turned and walked away, every instinct in her body screaming at her not to look back. As she stepped onto her porch, she thought about the missing tools, the misplaced molding, the cigarette smoke that sometimes lingered in the air when she came home late at night. The photo in her hand felt heavier than it should have. She didn't know what Harris meant by his words, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't safe. And she had no idea what was coming next. The fire started just past midnight, and by the time Rebecca woke up to the suffocating heat and the acrid sting of smoke, it was already too late to put up a fight. The alarms were shrieking, a high-pitched wail echoing through the house as orange light flickered against the bedroom walls, turning the familiar space into something monstrous. She barely had time to process what was happening before the searing heat drove her into action. The air was thick, choking, and her lungs burned as she staggered to the door, reaching for the handle before the realization hit her it was hot. Burning hot. She jerked her hand away just as the wood began to crackle, the paint bubbling and peeling under the heat. Panic set in. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but there was no clear path. The flames had already engulfed the staircase, and the hallway outside her bedroom was a wall of black smoke. She could hear glass shattering somewhere below, could feel the house groaning, the structure weakening as the fire consumed it from the inside out. Her mind raced. There was no way out through the door, no way down the stairs. The only option was the window. Rebecca ran to the bedroom window, fumbling with the lock as her fingers trembled. The frame stuck for a second, swollen from the heat, but she forced it open, coughing violently as the fresh night air hit her face. Below, the ground seemed impossibly far away. She had never thought about how high the second floor really was until now. There was no time to hesitate. The fire was moving fast, the smoke so thick she could barely see. Without another thought, she swung one leg over the ledge, gripping the frame for balance as she tried to steady herself. Then she heard it. A voice. Someone was outside. Through the haze of smoke and chaos, she could make out a figure standing on the front lawn watching. The glow of the fire illuminated him in sharp relief, and even though her vision was blurred with tears and smoke, she knew exactly who it was. Harris Welch. He wasn't running for help, wasn't shouting for her to jump. He was just standing there, hands in his pockets, staring up at her with the same measured indifference he always had. For a fraction of a second, time slowed. The noise, the heat, the panic had all faded into the background as Rebecca locked eyes with the man who had spent months trying to drive her out of this house. And in that moment she knew. This wasn't an accident. The sound of wood splitting behind her jolted her back to reality. The fire was seconds away from consuming the room entirely. With one last deep breath, she let go of the window frame and pushed herself off. The fall knocked the wind out of her. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her shoulder as she rolled onto the grass, gasping for air. The heat from the fire was unbearable, even from here, the flames roaring like a living thing, devouring everything she had built. She barely had time to register the pain before hands grabbed her, pulling her up roughly. Someone was shouting. Neighbors had started gathering, their faces illuminated by the fire. A woman was dialing 911, another was yelling for a garden hose, but it was useless. There was no saving the house. Rebecca turned, searching for Harris, but he was gone. The fire department arrived within minutes, but by then the damage was done. They worked quickly, shouting commands over the roar of the flames, but Rebecca already knew how this would end. Her house, her project, her dream was gone. Everything she had worked for, everything she had put into restoring this place, was turning to ash before her eyes. She didn't realize she was shaking until a paramedic wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, gently guiding her to sit on the curb. Her arm was throbbing, probably dislocated, but the pain barely registered. She was numb. Empty. Then the police arrived. And the first person they spoke to was Harris. He stood there, calm as ever, talking to an officer like they were old friends. Even from where she sat, Rebecca could see the expression on his face, detached, unconcerned. He gestured toward the house, said something that made the officer nod. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned and looked directly at her. And he smiled. It wasn't an arrogant smile. It wasn't mocking. It was small, subtle, just a flicker of satisfaction before he turned back to the officer. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. Something was very, very wrong. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the dizziness, ignoring the pain. The paramedic tried to stop her, but she pushed past him, moving toward the officer speaking with Harris. "That's him," she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "He did this." The officer turned to her, eyebrows furrowing. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." "No," she snapped, her breath coming fast, her heart pounding. "He started this fire. He's been trying to get me out of that house for months, and now it's gone. You need to." "Ms. Stillman," the officer interrupted, his tone shifting. "We were just discussing that." She froze. "Discussing what?" The officer sighed, glancing at Harris before pulling out a folded document. "Mr. Welch has provided records showing that this property is no longer yours." The words didn't make sense. She stared at him, then at the paper in his hand. "What are you talking about?" Harris finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost amused. "You sold it, Ms. Stillman." "A month ago." The world tilted. "That's a lie." The officer handed her the document, and her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Her name was there, her signature. The sale had been processed weeks before the fire. But that wasn't possible. She had never signed anything. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This is fake." "We'll investigate that," the officer said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't in any rush to do so. "But as of now, the official records show that this property belongs to Mr. Welch." Rebecca looked up at Harris, expecting to see that same smug expression, but what she saw was worse. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't taunting her. He was just watching, like he had been all along. A deep, sinking dread settled in her stomach. This wasn't just about the fire. This had been planned. And she had no idea how far it was going to go. Rebecca stood there, gripping the document so tightly that the paper crumpled in her hands. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It was impossible. She had never signed away her house. She had never agreed to sell. Yet there it was, her name, her signature, the legal stamp of approval indicating that the property had been transferred a full month ago. It didn't make sense. She had been living in the house, renovating it, pouring everything she had into it. If she had truly sold it, wouldn't she have been informed? Wouldn't she have had to vacate? How could someone claim ownership of something she had never given up? Harris didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The expression on his face was enough a quiet, knowing patience, as if he had already anticipated every reaction she would have, as if he had already planned out every response. He had expected her to protest. He had expected her to be confused, to be angry, to lash out. And he had come prepared. The officer, standing between them, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, as if he could sense that something wasn't quite right but didn't know how to act on it. Ma'am, if you believe this document is fraudulent, you'll need to take it up with the county records office. But as of now, the ownership transfer appears legitimate. We can't remove Mr. Welch from the property unless there's evidence of wrongdoing. Wrongdoing. The word made her stomach twist. There was plenty of wrongdoing here, there had to be, but the problem was proving it. She forced herself to breathe, to push back the rising panic. Then I want to file a report, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I want to report fraud. That is not my signature. The officer hesitated. I can take a statement, but you'll also need to contact a property attorney. This is a civil matter. Civil matter. Like her house had simply been lost in a paperwork mix-up. Like this wasn't something insidious, something deliberate. Harris gave her one last glance before stepping away, the conversation no longer interesting to him. As he moved, Rebecca felt something heavy settle inside her. He wasn't worried. He wasn't even remotely concerned that this could unravel on him. He had done this before. He had done it well. And now he was walking away because he knew the system well enough to understand that she was powerless. For now. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. The fire had gutted her house, and though the fire department had contained the flames before they could spread to neighboring properties, there was little left of the structure. She had spent hours at the station, filling out paperwork, recounting what had happened over and over again to different officers, each of them nodding sympathetically but offering no real solutions. She could stay in a motel, they told her, or find temporary housing while the legalities were sorted out. But she didn't want a motel. She wanted her house. By morning, she had a plan. She would start with the county recorder's office. If there had been a sale, there had to be records. There had to be some kind of trail leading back to the fraud. The woman at the county office was polite but efficient, pulling up the transaction within minutes. It was an off-market sale, she explained, clicking through documents on her screen. It looks like a direct transfer between parties, no real estate agents involved. That's pretty common when someone is selling to a developer or a private buyer they already know. Rebecca leaned forward. Can I see the paperwork? The woman hesitated. You'll need to submit a formal request for copies. Frustration flared, but Rebecca forced herself to remain calm. I just need to see the signature page. Please. The woman sighed but turned the monitor slightly. Rebecca's eyes locked onto the screen, heart pounding. There it was, the signature that was supposed to be hers. But it wasn't. It was close, eerily close, but she knew her own handwriting. Whoever had forged this knew exactly what they were doing. The pressure was perfect, the slant of the letters nearly identical. But there was one flaw, something small but definitive. Her middle initial. She never used it in legal documents. Ever. But there it was, scrawled neatly between her first and last name. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to think. Who signed as the witness? The woman scrolled down. Harris Welch. A chill ran down her spine. He had planned this meticulously. He had known exactly how to replicate her handwriting, how to manipulate the paperwork, how to make it all look legitimate. And the worst part? The system had let him. Rebecca turned away, gripping her phone. She needed a lawyer. Immediately. She reached out to David Langley, a property attorney with a reputation for handling cases of real estate fraud. When she explained the situation over the phone, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. This is bad, he said flatly. If what you're saying is true, we have a forgery case. But proving it will be a nightmare. I can prove the signature is fake, she insisted. And I never agreed to sell. That has to count for something. It does, Langley said, his tone measured. But we're dealing with real estate law, and that means layers of bureaucracy. If Welch has already transferred the title, we'll need to file a lawsuit to challenge the sale, and that could take months, maybe longer. Rebecca swallowed. I don't have months. Then we need to move fast. The next few days blurred together in a haze of legal filings, meetings, and growing frustration. Langley worked quickly, submitting requests for forensic analysis on the signature, filing a motion to freeze any further transactions involving the property. But even as they fought back, Harris moved faster. Construction crews arrived at the charred remains of her house, tearing down what little was left. When she confronted them, they handed her a work order signed by Harris. This land is being cleared for development, the foreman told her, barely looking up from his clipboard. Her land, her home. Rebecca clenched her fists, trying to keep the rage from consuming her. You can't do this. According to the deed, it's not yours anymore. It was happening, just like Harris had planned. The house was gone, the land was being prepped for something new, and if she didn't stop it soon, there would be nothing left to fight for. Langley met her outside the site, looking grim. I have some bad news. She laughed bitterly. Worse than this? She gestured to the demolition. Harris isn't acting alone, he said, lowering his voice. I did some digging. He's been doing this for years, not just with you. Rebecca's breath caught. What? There are at least 3 other properties in this area with the same pattern: suspicious fires, sudden ownership transfers, forged documents. But no one's ever been able to pin it on him. She stared at him, realization settling in. This wasn't just about her house. This was something bigger, something darker. And Harris wasn't just some bitter old man. He was a predator. And she was his next victim. Rebecca sat in Langley's office, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that her nails dug into the worn leather. Outside, the city hummed with life, people rushing to work, buses groaning under the weight of morning commuters, the distant wail of a siren piercing the background noise. But in here, inside these walls, the world was much smaller, reduced to case files, legal briefs, and the suffocating weight of what she had just learned. Harris Welch wasn't just her problem. He had done this before. Langley flipped through the stack of papers in front of him, his expression dark. I've gone over everything I could find on Welch. His name shows up in multiple property transfers, all within the last 15 years. The pattern is disturbingly consistent: small fires, sudden ownership changes, no public listings. No official sales announcements, just new names appearing on the deeds, and the old owners gone without much of a trace. He tapped a finger against one of the documents. And here's the real kicker: every single one of those properties was later flipped to developers for a massive profit. Rebecca exhaled slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. How is he getting away with this? Because he knows how to work the system, Langley said grimly. He's been in law enforcement. He understands the loopholes, knows exactly how to push just far enough without triggering alarms. By the time anyone realizes something is off, it's already too late. Rebecca's stomach twisted. So what happened to the previous owners? Langley hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of a file before sliding it toward her. That's where things get messy. I found records on a few of them. One filed for bankruptcy shortly after the sale, another moved out of state, and one, he stopped, running a hand down his face. One just disappeared. No forwarding address, no financial activity, nothing. Just gone. Rebecca swallowed hard, nausea creeping up her throat. And now it's happening to me. Langley leaned forward. Not if we stop it. But how? The law was a sluggish beast, and Welch was already 3 steps ahead. The land had been cleared. The legal battle over the ownership transfer could take months, even years. And in the meantime, Welch would keep tightening his grip, making sure she had nowhere to go, no resources to fight back with. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Langley glanced at her before rising to answer it. A woman stood in the doorway, her dark eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on Rebecca. She was older, mid-50s maybe, with sharp cheekbones and a posture that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk. "Rebecca Stillman?" Rebecca nodded cautiously. The woman stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I'm Catherine Hayes, investigative journalist." She reached into her bag, pulling out a slim notebook and a recorder. "I heard about what happened to your house, and I think I can help you." Rebecca frowned. "How do you know about?" Hayes cut her off with a slight tilt of her head. "Because I've been looking into Welch for years. You're not the first person he's done this to. But you might be the first person who has a chance to bring him down." Rebecca glanced at Langley, who was watching the journalist carefully, then back at Hayes. "How?" The woman set the recorder on the table but didn't turn it on yet. "I have sources, former colleagues of Welch, people who've worked with him, people who've seen what he's capable of. But what I need is evidence, something concrete. I've come close before, but every time I think I have something, it slips through my fingers. Either the victims back off, or the records conveniently disappear." She folded her arms. "I need someone willing to push back, someone who won't scare easily." Rebecca let out a hollow laugh. "You think I'm not scared?" Hayes studied her for a moment before nodding. "I think you are. But I also think you're angry enough to do something about it." Rebecca clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, but the truth was, the woman was right. Fear had been gnawing at her since the fire, since that moment she had seen Welch standing outside, watching her house burn. But beneath that fear, rage was growing, solidifying into something colder. She took a deep breath. "What do you need from me?" Hayes flipped open her notebook. "First, I need every interaction you've had with Welch, conversations, threats, strange encounters, anything that seemed off. Second, I need access to whatever paperwork Langley has been gathering. And third," she hesitated, glancing between them, "I need to know if you're willing to go further than just the legal route. Because Welch doesn't play fair, and if you really want to win this, you're going to have to be ready to get your hands dirty." Rebecca exhaled sharply, her mind racing. She had spent weeks clinging to the belief that justice could be found through the system, that if she just followed the right procedures, if she just proved what had been done to her, someone would make it right. But Welch wasn't just a man exploiting legal loopholes. He was something worse, something deeper, more ingrained in the very foundations of power. She looked at Langley, then back at Hayes. "Tell me what to do." The next few days were a blur of late-night meetings, hushed conversations, and a deep dive into the tangled mess Welch had left in his wake. Langley filed emergency injunctions to prevent any further development on the land, but they knew it was only a stalling tactic. Welch had money, resources, and connections, and he could keep the legal battle dragging on indefinitely if he wanted to. What they needed was something that couldn't be ignored. Hayes had contacts in places Rebecca hadn't even considered, former cops who had been on the force with Welch, the city officials who had quietly raised concerns about him before being silenced, even a retired judge who had suspected foul play in a case connected to Welch years ago, but had never been able to prove it. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together, revealing a man who wasn't just a predator but a master manipulator, someone who thrived in the gray areas of legality. And then the breakthrough came. A former contractor, someone who had worked on one of the properties Welch had acquired, came forward. His name was Paul Greer, a man in his 60s with a permanently hunched posture and eyes that held more regret than Rebecca had ever seen in a person. "I didn't know at first," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face as they sat in a quiet diner. "I was just doing the job, clearing out the rubble, prepping the land for whatever came next. But then I started noticing things, burn patterns that didn't match natural fire spreads, structural weaknesses that had been tampered with. And the worst part? He exhaled shakily. In one house before the fire, I found papers scattered on the floor, legal documents, bank statements. Like someone had gone through them in a hurry, looking for something. Rebecca's pulse quickened. You think the fires weren't just to force people out. You think they were covering something up. Greer nodded. I know they were. Hayes leaned forward. Can you prove it? The old contractor hesitated, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. Maybe. If you're willing to do what it takes to find out. Rebecca met his gaze, that same cold determination solidifying inside her. I'm ready. And for the first time since the fire, she felt like she had a chance of winning. Rebecca knew that once she crossed this line, there would be no turning back. The realization settled in the pit of her stomach like a cold stone, but the fear that had once paralyzed her had been burned away, leaving only purpose. She had spent weeks watching Harris Welch operate in the shadows, maneuvering the system with the precision of a man who had done this 100 times before, confident that no one would ever be able to touch him. And for years, no one had. But now she had something he didn't expect: momentum. The meeting with Paul Greer had changed everything. His testimony wasn't just another piece of circumstantial evidence, it was a window into the methods Welch had been using to force people out. One that proved the fires weren't just about property. There had been something deliberate behind them, something he needed to erase. Greer had worked on demolition crews for decades, but what he had seen while clearing Welch's properties had stuck with him. Burn patterns that looked intentional, inconsistencies in structural damage that suggested the fires had been strategically placed to ensure maximum destruction, and most disturbing of all, traces of paperwork left behind in homes where owners had supposedly left willingly. Documents that should have been taken if they had truly abandoned their properties. Rebecca spent hours going over the details with Langley and Hayes, mapping out every known case linked to Welch. The pattern was clear. He targeted homes that had either financial disputes or personal vulnerabilities, owners who were alone, struggling, or in situations where fighting back would be more trouble than it was worth. It had always worked before, until now. She didn't sleep much in the days that followed. Hayes had started digging deeper into Welch's history, and what she found only reinforced what they already suspected: Welch hadn't been acting alone. His name appeared alongside a handful of developers, people who had benefited from his acquisitions, sometimes within weeks of the properties changing hands. There were quiet payoffs, large sums of money moving between shell companies, and connections to city officials who had conveniently overlooked zoning disputes and environmental regulations. It was corruption at its most refined, carefully hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. But none of that would matter unless they had something concrete, something undeniable. And then Rebecca got her proof. It happened late one night, when she was sitting in her motel room, staring at the legal filings scattered across the table, her thoughts a tangled mess of frustration and exhaustion. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Miss Stillman? The voice was low, cautious. I need to talk to you. Now. Rebecca sat up, instantly alert. Who is this? A pause. Then, someone who used to work with Welch. I can't talk long, and I can't meet in public. But I have something you need to see. Rebecca felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Where? The voice gave her an address, an abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place people didn't go unless they had a reason to stay unseen. Every instinct told her it was dangerous, that she was walking into something that could be a trap. But if this was what she thought it was, she couldn't afford to ignore it. She called Langley and Hayes immediately, and against their protests, she insisted on going. Langley wouldn't let her go alone, and when they pulled into the darkened parking lot of the storage facility an hour later, she could feel the weight of his unease pressing against her own. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rusted metal, the flickering overhead lights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. a figure stepped out from behind one of the units. A man, older, maybe in his late 50s, with the wary posture of someone who had spent too much time looking over his shoulder. He was holding a small, battered folder, his fingers gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I don't have much time," he said, his voice hushed. "I shouldn't even be here." Rebecca stepped closer, keeping her movements slow, measured. "Who are you?" The man exhaled sharply. "Name's Mark Leland. I used to handle title transfers and property assessments for Welch's clients. I thought it was just business, just another job. But then I started seeing the same patterns you have. And when I started asking questions, Welch made it clear that I was asking the wrong ones." He looked over his shoulder, his paranoia almost palpable. "They don't like loose ends." Rebecca swallowed hard. "What do you have?" Leland hesitated for only a moment before handing her the folder. Records. Documents Welch thought were destroyed. Paper trails linking him directly to the fires, to the bribes, to the false sales. He looked at her, his gaze sharp with urgency. "This is enough to bury him. But it's also enough to make you a target." Rebecca opened the folder, scanning the first few pages, her breath catching at what she saw. It was all there. The fraudulent transactions, the forged signatures including hers, the internal memos discussing expedited clearance methods, emails between Welch and a handful of high-ranking city officials discussing acceptable collateral damage. It was overwhelming. It was infuriating. It was exactly what they needed. She looked up at Leland. "Why now? Why come forward?" Leland's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I watched Welch do this to too many people, and I'm done being afraid." The sound of a car approaching cut through the night air, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Leland stiffened. "You need to go," he said quickly. "They're watching me. They'll be watching you too." Rebecca barely had time to process before Langley grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the car. "We need to move. Now." They sped away, the headlights of the approaching vehicle shrinking in the rearview mirror. Rebecca clutched the folder to her chest, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. This was it. This was what they had been waiting for. The evidence that would finally bring Welch down. But as they drove through the empty streets, Langley's grip tightened on the wheel. "You understand what happens next, right?" Rebecca looked at him, her hands still trembling. "They're going to come after you." And deep down, she knew he was right. Welch wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. He had spent too long perfecting his game, eliminating obstacles before they could ever become threats. But this time he had underestimated her. This time she wasn't just another victim. This time she was ready to fight. Rebecca barely had time to think before the first threat arrived. It wasn't subtle, not the way Welch had operated before, with quiet intimidation and veiled warnings. This time it was blunt, unmistakable, a clear message that she had crossed a line. A brick through the motel window in the dead of night, glass shattering across the cheap carpet, a single sheet of paper taped to it with 3 words scrawled in thick, uneven ink. "Drop it now." She had expected retaliation. The moment she had held the folder in her hands, felt the weight of undeniable proof, she had known that Welch wouldn't sit back and let this happen. But knowing and experiencing were two different things, and as she stood barefoot among the shards, her heart pounding against her ribs, she understood that the rules had changed. He wasn't just trying to bury evidence anymore. He was trying to silence her. Langley insisted on moving her immediately. The motel was no longer safe, and they couldn't risk Welch knowing her location. Hayes was already working on getting the files to the right people, trusted sources in law enforcement, contacts in the media who had been waiting for something solid. But Rebecca knew they were racing against time. Welch had survived this long because he had learned how to control the flow of information, how to shut things down before they could spread. If he realized how much they had, if he figured out who else had seen the documents, he would go after them just as easily as he was coming after her. They relocated to a small safe house owned by one of Langley's former clients, a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was secure. Rebecca spent the next 24 hours barely sleeping, her mind running through every possible scenario. She had spent weeks fighting to prove Welch's guilt, but now she had to survive long enough to make sure he actually faced consequences. The police weren't an option. Not yet. Welch had too many connections, and until this case had enough traction, reporting him would only serve as a warning, giving him time to clean up whatever loose ends remained. They needed the media. They needed a public outcry, something big enough that even Welch couldn't suppress it. Then the second message came. It was late. Langley had left for a meeting, and Hayes was on the phone in the other room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Rebecca had stepped outside for air, the weight of the past few days pressing heavy against her chest. The night was still, unnervingly quiet. And then she saw it. A car parked just across the street, its engine off, its windows tinted dark. It had been there for hours. At first she had told herself it was paranoia, that it was nothing, just a coincidence. But as she stood in the cold air, she saw the faint glow of a cigarette through the windshield, the ember flaring, then dying like a silent signal. Someone was watching. Her stomach twisted, adrenaline slamming through her veins. She turned quickly, moving back inside, locking the door behind her. When she checked the window again, the car was gone. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Langley burst through the door, his face pale, his expression set in a way she had never seen before. He was holding his phone in one hand, the screen glowing with a news article. "It started," he said, his voice low. Rebecca grabbed the phone, scanning the headline. Former police officer tied to alleged real estate fraud ring. Hayes had done it. The first wave of information had hit, and now the story was spreading. The article was careful with its wording, not outright accusing Welch but laying out the pattern, the inconsistencies in past sales, the connections to suspicious fires. It was enough to cause a stir, enough to get people talking, enough to make Welch desperate. That night, the safe house was attacked. It started with a noise, a dull metallic clang against the back door, a sound that sent a spike of fear through Rebecca's chest. Langley had gone out again, but Hayes was in the next room, and the two women exchanged a glance that confirmed the same realization. This wasn't over. Then the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the refrigerator dying, the faint glow of streetlights outside suddenly blotted out as thick shadows swallowed everything. Rebecca's breath came fast, her mind racing. Hayes was already moving, grabbing the emergency flashlight, her fingers tightening around the handle of the small handgun she kept in her bag. "We need to get out," Hayes whispered, her voice tight. "Now." Rebecca nodded, forcing her body to move, to push past the fear locking up her muscles. They moved toward the front door, but as soon as they reached it, they heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching outside. A car, stopping fast. Doors slamming. Footsteps. Welch wasn't waiting anymore. Panic threatened to take hold, but Rebecca forced it down, grabbing the folder of documents, clutching it to her chest as if it were a shield. Hayes was already reaching for her phone, but before she could dial, a heavy fist pounded against the door. "Rebecca," a voice called, smooth, calm, almost amused. "Welch, I think it's time we talked." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Hayes shook her head sharply, mouthing, "Don't answer." But Rebecca could hear it in Welch's voice, the easy arrogance, the certainty. He knew they were in there. The doorknob rattled and, for a moment, Rebecca thought he might just kick the door in. But instead, there was silence. Then, a slow, deliberate chuckle. "You think this ends with an article?" Welch said, his voice muffled through the door. "You think this little stunt is going to change anything? You don't know how this game is played." Vrishum. Blah. Rebecca clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You're going to lose," Stillman, Welch continued, his voice darkening. You can fight all you want, but you're playing in my world now. And in my world, people like you don't win. Silence stretched. Then, the sound of footsteps retreating, tires squealing, and just like that, he was gone. Rebecca let out a shaky breath, barely realizing she had been holding it. Hayes locked the door again, her hands shaking slightly as she turned to Rebecca. We need to go public. Now. Rebecca nodded, already dialing Langley. The fear was still there, the weight of Welch's threat pressing against her like a vice. But beneath it, something else was growing. Rage. Welch had been untouchable for too long, but now he was on edge. Now he was making mistakes. He had shown up in person, had let his arrogance push him into a direct confrontation. And that meant one thing. He was scared. And for the first time since this had started, Rebecca knew without a doubt she was going to take him down. Rebecca didn't wait for the fear to settle in. Fear had no place anymore. The moment Welch showed up at the safe house, taunting her like he had already won, she knew that he was losing control. He had always operated from the shadows, manipulating the system, orchestrating disasters that looked like accidents. But now he was making mistakes. Now he was acting out of desperation. And that meant she had him exactly where she needed him. By the time Langley arrived, the decision had already been made. The story was going public. Not just an article buried beneath other news, not just a quiet legal battle that could be stalled for years. This was going to be an avalanche, one too big to ignore. Hayes had been preparing for this moment, gathering everything they had, making sure there was no room for doubt. They weren't just exposing Welch's fraud. They were tying him to the network that had enabled him, the corrupt officials who had looked the other way, the developers who had profited from stolen properties. Every name, every document, every detail was going live. The next morning, the headlines exploded. Real estate corruption scandal, former police officer implicated in decades-long property scheme. Rebecca barely had time to process the impact before the calls started flooding in. Reporters, attorneys, government officials, everyone wanted a statement, a confirmation, a piece of the story. The mayor's office issued a response within hours, distancing itself from the mess, promising an internal investigation. The police department, once so dismissive of her claims, suddenly announced that they were reopening old cases tied to Welch. The heat was coming down fast, and for the first time it wasn't on her. It was on him. Welch didn't show up at his house that night. In fact, he didn't show up anywhere. When the arrest warrant was issued, he was already gone. Rebecca wasn't surprised. He had spent his entire life staying one step ahead, and he wouldn't stop now. But this time, running wouldn't be enough. His face was plastered across the news, his crimes dissected in real time by anchors and legal analysts. There was nowhere left to hide. It took 3 days for them to find him. Langley called her the moment the news broke. They got him. Rebecca sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the words. Where? Border Patrol. He was trying to get into Canada. She exhaled slowly. And they're bringing him back. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt victorious. But instead, all she felt was exhaustion. Welch would finally face consequences, but it didn't change what he had taken from her. It didn't rebuild her home, didn't erase the fear that had become a constant presence in her life. The trial took months, and Welch fought every step of the way. He denied everything, claimed he was being set up, insisted that he had done nothing wrong. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness came forward, people he had threatened, people he had stolen from. The forensic analysis of the signatures sealed the deal. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict. Guilty. Rebecca sat in the courtroom as the judge read the sentence, 25 years. No parole for at least 15. It was longer than she had expected, but somehow it still didn't feel like enough. Welch turned his head slightly, looking at her from across the room. There was no anger in his expression, no outrage. Just that same quiet calculation, the same look he had given her when her house was burning. As they led him away, he finally spoke, just loud enough for her to hear. "You think you won?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The aftermath was messy. The legal battles over the stolen properties dragged on, and while Welch's conviction helped, it didn't automatically undo the damage. Some victims got their land back. Others didn't. Developers feigned ignorance, pretending they had no idea where the properties had come from. The system Welch had exploited for years was slow to correct itself. Too slow. Rebecca knew she couldn't stay. Her house was gone. The land it had stood on was still tangled in legal disputes, and even if she won it back, she wasn't sure she could ever live there again. It wasn't home anymore. It was just a graveyard of everything she had lost. She left the city a month after the trial. She packed what little she had left and walked away, not because she was running, but because there was nothing left for her there. The past had already burned, and she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life sifting through ashes. Years later, she saw his name again. A brief mention in an article, buried beneath bigger headlines. Disgraced former officer denied appeal. She didn't click on it. She didn't need to. She was already living her next chapter. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder.